Hello,
Done.
guests. Welcome back to another World of Wargaming episode of MCA Scuttlebutt. Today, I have a returning guest, Ian Brown, but as well also Sebastian Bay, who is a wargame designer with the Center for Naval Analysis. Gentlemen, how are you today?
Good,
You can go
and it's
ahead,
good to
Ian.
be back. Yeah, no, it's good. Will appreciate you having me back on here for another thing. I love the World of Wargaming series. I'm glad you guys are doing it. So happy to be back in a slightly different capacity.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So we're going to start off just quickly, Ian. You've been on the show before, but some of our new listeners, do you mind just doing a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Last time I was on, I was Major Ian Brown. Now I'm just Mister. I retired from the Marine Corps this summer, and I was at the Krulak Center. I was there last time we spoke. Obviously, I'm not there anymore. Although I'm happy to say they sort of kept me on in an unofficial capacity as a distinguished fellow, so I can still go and do things for them, which is great. And then right now, I work at Group W as a war game analyst.
Awesome. And Sebastian, since you're new to our show, do you mind just providing some context to who you are to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Sebastian Bay. I'm a senior game designer and research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis, also known as CNA. I also serve as an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown Center for Security Studies in the School of Foreign Service, where I teach a game design course where my students design, research, and develop an original educational war game, often for DoD sponsors. I also was a former Krulak Fellow at MCU when Ian was there as an action officer when his days in uniform. And I also am the faculty advisor and founder of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society.
All right, that's awesome. Thanks for coming on the show. So let's kick it off today. The topic of the conversation today for our audience is going to be just a general overview and history of the application of wargaming in the Marine Corps. So let's go to day one. How did wargaming become introduced to the Marine Corps?
Hey, Ian, you want to take the first swing?
Uh, yeah, sure. I before we get too far, I think we're probably gonna like miss some stuff here and there. So if our audiences want like kind of the full story, the article that our research is kind of based off on appeared in the Journal of Advanced Military Studies, volume 2, 2021, and any all the footnotes, fancy pictures, and stuff. If you want to get into those, that's where you can find the article. The article is called "Promise Unfulfilled: A Brief History of Educational Wargaming in the Marine Corps." So, I guess like trying to figure out like wargaming started in the Marine Corps was kind of part of our reason for doing this because there was obviously a lot of energy about it when General Berger took over as commandant. And I think like kind of both Sebastian and I knew from our various backgrounds, like we'd sort of been here before. So in the Marine Corps, like lots of excitement, and then it sort of didn't stick. It's a word we use a lot. Like it just didn't institutionally, it did stick. It kind of ebbed and flowed. So we kind of wanted to like trace the thread back to the beginning as best we could find it in terms of the documented history, and then offer some thoughts on like, okay, how do we get it to stick this time? Because it seems like it's great, lots of excitement, resources being applied. But let's make it last, beyond a few years. Um, so where did the Marine Corps start wargaming? It's sort of lost in a little bit in the mist of time, but we did find some interesting things. And among that was that, not really surprising, was that sort of the genesis of Marine Corps wargaming, very closely tied to what the Naval War College was doing in wargaming, really going back to the beginning of the 20th century. Um, and a lot of people are familiar with the sort of interwar years between World War One, World War Two, war games the Naval War College undertook that were very informative and influential on the American naval leaders who would be fighting, especially in the Pacific in World War Two. But as it happens, like Marine Corps as a naval service, um, their thread sort of goes through the story there a little bit. So in the article, we kind of went back to like the beginning of wargaming. The Naval War College was kind of started in around 1884 when the War College was founded. There was a Captain William McCarty Little who started running these things called war problems. And from there, a few different game sets were introduced to the Navy students who went through there, going from like a kind of a one-on-one contest test between individual ships, all the way up to movement of multiple fleets across huge geographic areas. And over time, the Naval War College kind of honed in on the latter two, sort of into like fleet on fleet and multiple fleets versus multiple fleets. But sort of adjacent to this, um, every now and then we sort of found in the historiography, references to Marines being present at these games. And I think the earliest documented reference that we could find, I owe to, I don't know if he's listening, but BJ Armstrong, who's a Navy officer today, and he's also a historian, published author as well. But he said, I forget what we were talking about. I think it was a different historical topic because he had published a book called on sort of naval guerrilla warfare, small boats and daring men. But in the course of that, he had been going into the Admiral Sims papers archive in the National Archives up in DC. So, he was talking about that. And I think Sebastian and I had already sort of decided to start going off. And then she said, "Oh, you got to look at the Sims archives because I found there's like this poem about Pete Ellis. And I don't remember what it said, but like it talked about him at the Naval War College doing their naval war game. You should go check it out." So I did, and it turned out in The Sims, like this is something that we never would have found on our own had not BJ sort of put us on the line to that. But I'm so glad that he did because, to my knowledge, again, first documented reference we could find of a Marine doing wargaming, and what it is, it's a limerick. It's like something you would, say it's sort of a drunken mess night with your friends, but it's a limerick about Pete Ellis, and if you'll bear with me, I want to read it because I love this story. It's the first documented reference about Pete Ellis kind of being pretty good at it. And it goes, "There's a frisky Marine they call Ellis, whose ability makes some folks jealous. He's a soldier, all right, but a tactical blight. He can plot on the board, so your fleet's always gored. He can hand you a whack from a torpedo attack, and with gleeful elation, he'll quell us." So beginning, Marine Corps was clearly plugged in with what the War College was doing at the time, and it turned out we were pretty good at it back then. And as we sort of dug through the historiography later on, we started seeing more and more references to Marine Corps officers being adjacent and being present at some of these games as students. So that was kind of the earliest beginning we could find. Sebastian, anything you want to add about that, or
Yeah.
the
So would it be appropriate to say that Pete Ellis is one of like the forefathers of Marine Corps wargaming?
uh,
So I'm so before Ian says anything, I would say I don't think I would go so far as that saying that. Pete Ellis was definitely a seminal figure in the Marine Corps. As we look backwards, he becomes more important as we think about his writings and the time. But in terms of wargaming, the origin story for the Marine Corps is sort of like Ian has said, sort of lost to time. When we were doing this research paper originally for MCU and the journal issue at JAMS, we went down several like articles at the Gazette, looking at old Sam's, old EWS papers, and so forth, and trying to find this path through citations and footnotes and references to each other. And the first real solid institutional reference that we could find, at least in our research, was back I think in 1960 when the Marine Corps established the Marine Corps Landing Force Development Center, which later would become the War Games Group, and then later morphed into the War Games branch, and then eventually what we call like McWill and the Wargaming Division today, right? So there's like this loose connection between all those organizations as they slowly morphed. And you know what I mean? It's hard to say who would be the forefather, but right around 1960 is usually when the Marine Corps really institutionalized wargaming, and it was institutionalized specifically to look at how the Marine Corps could develop amphibious warfare. Right, so this is after World War II. This is after Korea. And looking towards the Marine Corps sort of advantage, and for those who are aware of Marine Corps history, is like this is also like around the time where the Marine Corps sort of solidified its amphibious role in like congressional legislation, right? So this is sort of that beginning of that chapter of the Marine Corps' identity.
So who were so for our audience, who were some of these players starting in 1960s when the Marine Corps really, for I guess for the I is it correct to say for the first time started taking war game more seriously, at least as an individual service? Who are some of the players and key movers of this wargaming push?
So when we were looking
Yes,
back
Sebastian.
through the research, I we found we didn't find references to like who the directors were, and I at least we didn't go down that route of finding the exact individuals who ran these. Often we found them in reference in other articles. For example, like one of the first things we found about the Landing Force War game that was originally developed by the Landing Force Development Center was by a captain, like Captain Montague. In his amphibious warfare school study, like his thesis for school, and he referenced how wargaming could be used for the fleet marine force, right? And this was like dated 1965 or 66, and he's like, hey, like this new center has been stood up, this is how we can be used. And the game, the Landing Force War game, or LFWG, was originally used predominantly for analysis, wasn't used for education. So his big push was like, hey, we should also include wargaming as education, a theme that you'll see later repeat over and over again, like games being used for analysis, and then there's a push for education and so forth, right? So there's always this tension and sort of symbiosis, but the analysis often tends to be the leading element because there's often the money and the institutional prerogatives all there. But and we can talk more about the game later. But I don't know if Ian has anything to add.
Yeah, no, like as Sebastian said, sort of, finding who the by name forefather was difficult, and a lot of information we got was sort of adjacent to the things that were going on, um, which was sort of ironic because the Marine Corps historically has done a very good job of documenting its own history, but this was something that just had not received a lot of attention. But yeah, in terms of the nature of the landing force war game, again, something we had in the article. I think Sebastian found sort of like a flow chart for how it worked. Um, we kind of go on. There's sort of a reason why this particular type of game didn't get more widespread adoption at the time, and part of that was because it was, as Sebastian said, designed for analysis, so not necessarily designed with the user interface for a I don't not say a casual player, but somebody who's not there to spend weeks at a time doing analysis. It was a highly detailed game, which also made it highly complicated. And I think one of the sources had said to replicate 24 hours of combat operations in the game took you 6 months. So that's a bit of a challenge, as something to widely disseminate, to plug into very tight, training schedules for operating force units. You could have as much enthusiasm as you wanted, but you go tell the boss, yeah, we're going to war game and it's going to take us, the entire day to go through 5 minutes of game time. That's not an easy sell.
So where does it go from there?
So after the Landing Forces War game and this sort of push for education, the Marine Corps responded with a great title called The Educational War Game. No joke, they call it The Educational War Game. Um, and it decided in a bunch of amphibious warfare schools papers, and also junior and senior school papers, and other big Marine Corps Gazette articles and sort of forth, as like the push to add more wargaming back into the sort of the captain's course, or what we call EWS, and amphibious warfare school at the time. And it was really just a semi-simplified version of the Landing Forces war game. It had a lot of the core mechanics the same. The rules were a lot of it transported. It still rests on this notion of issuing a series of orders and being adjudicated by these sort of tables. So both the educational war game and the Landing Forces war game use like combat tables. Like think of it as like, hey, if I have X number of tanks and I'm firing at this range, like what is my probability of hit? It also had like probability of detections, and all these sort of like complex tables to sort of help with determining the effects of combined arms. One of the cool elements of these games was like it had notions of like how long it takes for something to be issued and followed as a unit. So it had all these really interesting elements to it, and it borrowed pretty heavily from like wargaming mechanics that were commercially available. So like if you think about the 60s and 70s and 80s, were sort of the high upturn of gaming commercially. And this sort of represented that as well. So like we'll talk about it a bit later, but commercial wargaming really sort of peaked in the 70s and 80s, where another series of games came out in the Marine Corps as well.
So is this movement I guess more is it more bottom up as in you see a lot of like younger officers or captains or lower level officers trying to promote this thing up, or is this like are they these generals or the commandant trying to push this wargaming down to the force?
So I think kind of until really arguably until you got into the 90s, it was there was sort of pressure. There was pressure from the bottom, and sometimes from the middle as well. For example, the Marine Corps Warfighting, sorry, the Marine Corps Landing Forces Development Center and their Landing Force War Game. That wasn't just a bunch of lieutenants and captains getting together and trying to push from the bottom up. That was I'm not sure that I don't know the scale of the center itself, but that was a headquarters Marine Corps entity that decided to, you know, build a war game for a certain purpose. But a lot of I think the energy going into the quote unquote golden age really was from the bottom up, and as we talk about in the essay, a lot of the sources you read, you look at like the ranks and titles of the authors, and it's captains and majors and some lieutenants, who are really both they're the most vocal about it, making recommendations about it, but also sort of also asking up to higher like give us something to sort of scratch this itch because we think this could be really really useful for our own professional development and that of our Marines.
And is there institutional pushback? I mean, because you mentioned, there's sort of a heyday around, you said the late 70s, 80s. And why doesn't it expand at that time and point?
So I would say the educational war game itself that was spun off from the Atlantic Forces war game failed for all of the same reasons. The Atlantic Force war game in itself did not expand further than like sort of headquarters Marine Corps and the main wargaming branch because it was too hard to run, the rules were too complex, and it was way too granular, right? um, so even though the educational war game was simplified, it was already starting off from a really complex point and wasn't simple enough to be disseminated outwards to the force, right? Um, this is not saying these games weren't good, right? The game was originally designed to be an analytical war game to help the Marine Corps really think through amphibious warfare in the 60s. And the way to answer your first question or your last question would be is it was a top-down push to a certain point, right? And then you saw this sort of, or at least we see signs of young captains, young majors, and even some lieutenant colonels of saying like, "Hey, the war game institutionally has been pushed down to this echelon, right? But we think it should go all the way down, right?" And there's this call and effort of saying, "Hey, how do we pull this down further and further down to our echelons, right?" Because they see benefit at the higher echelons, and now we want it all the way down, right? Um, and then I would say that that push and that also probably a series of institutional elements really led to the 70s boom, right? Of Marine Corps wargaming, what me and Ian in the article called like the golden age, right? With like parentheses, right? Because which is like where the TAC War family of games came out, which was often referred to as a series or a family. There are four distinct games as part of this TAC War family of games. TAC War, which was a company level war game, a battalion level war game called Steel Thrust, and this was sort of think of what we consider a modern MEU game, a battalion landing team sort of game, right? And then Landing Force was for what they call regiments or or brigade level sort of staffs. And then the strategic level game, what we call the MEF, right? The game was called Warfare. So think of this sort of as a pyramid of games, right? For different echelons, the game changes and morphs. So like TAC War is much more similar to what most people think of war games is like miniature figures and counters on maps and like very tactical focus of like how far can I see, how far can I shoot, how far can I see you sort of thing. Designing sort of captains and lieutenants at that tactical problem. And then as you move from TAC War to Steel Thrust to Landing Force to Warfare, the games become more and more like staff X's, right? Like exercises where they're still playing games, there's still map elements to it, but it's more and more about like how do we operate as a staff, how do we conduct these actions, how do we issue orders, how do we manage the operational art as we call it today, right? And it was more like a CPX, right? But there are elements of it, but the idea was of the TAC War family of games was to push these games out to every echelon, as deep as the company level, for the game for their appropriate level, right? Because the educational war game was sort of took this mentality of like this one game will be the game for everyone, right? And in the 70s, the Marine Corps is like, maybe that's not the right way, right? And they're like, hey, we're going to think of a game for each sort of major echelon of the Marine Corps, right? So if you're a captain, you're playing TAC War, right? But if you are a major or lieutenant colonel on a staff, right, on a MEU or MEF or MEB, you're playing steel thrust or landing force, right? If you're probably at headquarters Marine Corps or at the MEF staff, you're playing warfare, right? Each of those sort of tailored to the perspectives and decisions that they are looking at the world and the operational and tactical problems they're looking at. Um, I pass it over to Ian to add any reinforcing remarks.
Yeah, so I think with the talking through the TAC War stuff, we'll back to your original point, where did the drive come from? To give credit where credit is due, TAC War and the family of games, they were disseminated around the service, and I think the goal it was first created around 1981, and the goal was that every rifle company in the Marine Corps would have a copy by 1983. That's a lot of rifle companies, and so that's something that had a would have had to have sort of service level resourcing and distribution to actually make that happen. But what I think is interesting here, and there's a couple other things to mention in this golden age, quote unquote, as well, which is uh, you know dissemination of TAC war, but also as we get into the 80s, this is when computing power is starting to become more widely available to a wider audience, right? So not everybody's got a personal computer on their desk yet in the 1980s, but computers are now like no longer just the purview of like getting people on the moon kind of thing, right? They can be used by slightly lower entities and they don't cost as much. So sort of adjacent to the dissemination of TAC War as a tabletop family of games, you saw the Marine Corps start to look at also, hey, what can we do with computers? Marine Corps, they borrowed something that the Navy had already built called the Tactical Warfare Simulation Evaluation and Analysis System, and spun off sort of their own variant called the Marine Air Ground Task Force Tactical Warfare Simulation, or MTWAS, which is a variation that's still in use today, actually. So these are things that it's not just a captain or some rogue colonel over at the warfighting lab, you know, sending hundreds of copies of TAC War out to the entire fleet, or buying a multi-million-dollar computer system to run MTWAS. So that there had to have been some top-down level decision making in terms of the resourcing all of this. Although interestingly as well, I don't think we could find in our research sort of like the big names who were the ones who signed off on this. Like, who was the general that signed off on building TAC War and fielding it, or buying TAC or buying MTWAs and upgrading the code. And I think more importantly, something else our article talks about is not just buying this stuff, but encouraging and like mandating slash giving top down cover to use this and devote time out of your busy training schedule to use these things. And based on our research, it really wasn't until the late 90s that a commandant sort of comes into the picture and gives that top down authority to not just resource these things but use them. And that was when General Charles Krulak, when he was commandant, signed Marine Corps Order 1500.55, titled Military Thinking and Decision Making Exercises, which essentially said, you not only you can go forth and do wargaming, I want you to. I am going to allow you to do it on government computers, even, which in this day and age, like, I can't think of putting a copy of, Fortnite on a government computer right now, right? Like, it's just not going to happen. But General Kulak encouraged that, and he even one of the things that came out under him was a modification of the game Doom 2 first person shooter called Marine Doom, which put on put new avatars and skins for Marine Corps uniforms, equipment, and weapons. So that was sort of the top down cover that hadn't really come in terms of the authorities and permissions to use these things down through the lowest level and devote time to it. Unfortunately, it was kind of about the time the general and interesting note that Marine Corps Order 1500.55 still shows as an active order under the list of Marine Corps orders if you go onto their website. So never rescinded. So we've always had the authority to play Doom on our computers, apparently. But it was right around the time that like General Kulak pushed this out, where I think we also kind of identified the mission creep that has often undermined past wargame activities started sneaking into these systems. So Sebastian, I'll hand it back to you if you want to talk a little bit about how that mission creep started affecting the enthusiasm and use of wargaming.
Yeah, so TAC War was originally built in like 74, 74, 75. It was like what Ian mentioned, disseminated to the force along with other games later in the Marine Corps. And was it MTWARS was like, I think in the late 70s, early 80s. This also coincided with the use of tactical decision games in the Marine Corps Gazette. You know what I mean? So like there was a lot of history blending over. And it was really interesting to see and sort of trace this, but also at the same time, you see this sort of inflection in the late 80s of sort of being more critical of TAC war, right? Because as we'd mentioned before, like TAC war was a response to the model fits all sort of model for educational and analytical gaming. But then mission creep happened, right? Like they wanted to make TAC war more and more responsive, more granular, more reflective of reality, and there was this push to make it do more, right? So like for instance, TAC War, the company version had like originally only had one basic module, and then it had an amphibious module and had a desert module, and each of these rules and terrains sort of required more rules, right? To the point that it became more and more laborious to run, right? It became harder for company commanders to run these things, and it became harder and harder, right? So you'll see like a string of Marine Corps Gazette articles by Walters and others extolling commercial gaming because they were saying these games are more accessible, easier to do, while at the same time saying TAC War, which was the official Marine Corps war game for education, was increasingly difficult, and they found it to be limiting. Right, so eventually. There's this sort of rise and fall with it. The GWAT happens in the early 2000s, and that also sort of shifts the eye away from sort of educational and analytical wargaming, amphibious warfare, or maritime routes, and all that jazz. And one thing before I hand it back to Ian is like it didn't mean like wargaming went away during the GWAT years. Like the Marine Corps Gazette and Atomic Games and the Marine Corps partner up to create a version called Close Combat Marine in 2004, um, based off a commercial digital game called Close Combat, right? Um, and it was supposed to be like a replacement, right? It was supposed to reproduce the TAC war successes, right? To the point that like people would say like, hey, like they gave out free CDs like attached to Gazette articles, right? Gazette manual magazines, and like it just didn't have the same success. And we couldn't say why exactly. A part of it's probably the focuses of Iraq and Afghanistan at the time, but also like it just institutionally, the Marine Corps just did not care as much, nor did it give the institutional cover to focus on these things, right? But then a sort of boom and bust cycle of gaming happens. But they were also like signs of it being used, right? Like Brendan McBean, who was a major at the time, like you'll see a little like SOP of how to use Close Combat Marine, right? So it's like some units did use them, and even to the point that they created like little like manuals for them to learn how to use it, but it didn't really permeate very far.
So that's interesting that because I've actually played the Close Combat series and that it didn't catch on. Maybe was it I guess part of it I guess the niche gameplay or I mean, or I guess as you probably answered the question already, just because the focus was on the global war on terror, that it became subsidiary. That's interesting. So you're right. Wargaming didn't go away during the '90s during the global war on terror, but when did the resurgence start happening?
Um, so kind of we traced it to a a general upswing back in like the mid 20 teens. And as Sebastian said, we couldn't really identify one specific reason, except in, increased attention to the GWAT, sort of focus everybody's attention on those problems that were out there. It's just sort of it's ironic, and it's a little sad in some ways to think that um, it was viewed as like an either or option. Hey, we can do wargaming or we can prepare for the GWAT. When one of the purposes of doing wargaming was to mentally prepare yourself and your staff and your Marines, for potential contingencies that they might face. All right, and you uh, do that using a war game to sort of fill in time in your training, your education pipeline to go study GWAT problems. And it's just ironic. It's seen, and we couldn't really find a good answer as to why that didn't happen. Because again, kind of going back to the golden age, there were some identified instances where war games were specifically teed up to look at very close, military problems. One example we talked about in the article was on the eve of Operation Desert Storm. There were infantry Marines who used the venerable, hex encounter game Advanced Squad Leader to conduct sort of tabletop rehearsals on how to breach prepared Iraqi defenses, and they used the mechanics of the game to develop specific leapfrogging tactics, using mortars, smoke, heavy weapons as a combined arms approach, to effectively breach through these things. So, with increased availability of war games, especially on computers, when, going into 2000s, now you're starting to get to the point everybody's got a personal computer, right? It's just, it's very curious that the potential tool, especially, and was something owned by the Marine Corps, like the close combat Marine game, was sort of put on the shelf. You're like, we got to look at the real military problem here in the GWAT, and uh, you know, there were now more tools available than ever to look at military problems and kind of go through, what if, and build yourself a virtual world to practice some of those things before you went in to do it for real. Um, it, this is just it's strange. It's odd that that's why you war game, is to get ready for actual war and conflict. And then when one came around, we put it on the shelf. But getting back to like kind of the upswing, like I said, looking at sort of mid 20 teens, y- there were some bubbles of continuity. There was the case method project at Marine Corps University, which was an ongoing program for many years there, using decision forcing cases again, provide a mental sandbox to improve decision making skills. And kind of you're getting around about this time as well within the professional military education, arena at least. You had, again, sort of these individuals, these islands of excellence, who through force of personality and the belief of those personalities and the value of it, started to integrate wargaming again into as a formal part of a curricula. Dr. James Lacey at the Marine Corps War College was one person who did this using a number of different tabletop games. At the School of Advanced Warfighting, you had Dr. Benjamin Jensen, who's using the computer game Command, to sort of look at a different problem set. The point was you had a few individuals doing it, um, but then the real upswing, sort of like again, what drove us to write this piece in the first place was coming in 2019 when General David Berger took over as commandant. Um, Wargaming was all over his commandant's planning guidance. Very, very clear that he thought it was an important tool that was not being utilized, and that Marines in education and training and experimentation needed to go forth and do more of this.
So part of, I guess, the one of the major concerns when you wrote your article was the fact that you wanted the current wargaming moment to stick. Uh, how do you think the Marine Corps is in a position to make it stick? What do you think should be needed to help make it stay around, so that wargaming continues to be a useful tool both for analysis as we say on the show, getting your sets and reps in to to practice tactic strategies and operations.
Go ahead,
Sebastian,
Ian.
you want to start on that? Oh, you want to start?
Yeah.
um, so I guess I'll say like, and it's as I'm out of uniform now, slightly different perspective, but I think we in the article we sort of threw out a number of recommendations for how you could sort of get this institutional moment to endure beyond the initial enthusiasm. Um, and it's been a couple of years since we wrote the article, and I've now been detached, from the active duty Marine Corps for about half a year at this point. So we sort of had a chance to watch, some of those trend lines and see where they've gone. And I guess from my perspective, again, this is my personal opinion, nobody else's. Um, I am, I have some cautious optimism that we may have actually planted some of the seeds, and I say we, like the royal we, right? Like the Marine Corps and the various institutions and individuals within it, to have planted, some better seeds for success, right? Like I think the biggest question that Sebastian and I probably both had in writing this in 2021 was like, okay, we know that General Berger is going to leave the Marine Corps 2023. And there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm at the time. Will this last once those people rotate out, or once those people retire? And yeah, I think it's still an open question, right? But some of the things that were just getting started back when we wrote that piece have grown. So, for example, we mentioned in the piece, um, there's a right about the time that retired Marine Colonel Tim Barrick was hired as a wargaming director at Marine Corps University, and he was sort of just put in charge of a number of things, not just in PME, but also setting up the first of its kind cloud-based wargaming environment for a military service in the U.S. And he's done that, right? Like that one initial operational capability, I think, in the winter of 2022, and the capability of that cloud-based wargaming has only grown. It's been stress tested through a number of tournaments in which students from both U.S. and international militaries were invited to, one to sort of friendly competition against each other, right? But also to stress test a cloud-based system to see if we could achieve the goal of having hundreds of Marines on there at the same time using these cloud-based war games to conduct PME homework or to conduct unit type training, or conduct professional military education. So that effort is still going, very strong, and it's only gotten more robust since it was at initial operational capability. And then this coming summer, or yeah, next summer, the Marine Corps Wargaming and Analysis Center, now called the Neller Center after General Neller, who kind of got the ball rolling on the groundbreaking it is going to open and begin its initial operational capability as well, and that's going to provide it's a Marine Corps more Wargaming Center, but I have no doubt that it'll be made available to the other services, as needed or as asked for. But now you're going to have a service level, um, highly resourced and high fidelity wargaming center where you can bring in senior commanders and decision leaders around into a very detailed, accurate virtual environment, and get them to to play out, to stress test this, the higher level plans and decisions that they have to make at the levels they are. So between like the Wargaming Cloud and the Wargaming Center, those are pretty big institutional investments, and that they are ongoing and haven't wound up on a cutting block somewhere. I think is indicative that there's a real service commitment to it, um, in those respects.
All right, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Well, as we start to wrap up our interview, I appreciate you guys for coming on the show. It's been great to have you. Ian, you've already answered this question last time, so I'll pass on to Sebastian. So, Sebastian, you get home from a day of, hard day of work. You've been teaching students how to war game. You pour yourself a glass of whiskey, and what war game are you going to play? What's your favorite war game?
Oh man, I guess like the smart thing to say is my own game, right? My own Littoral Commander war game. But um, I wouldn't. Mainly because it shine the game shines when you play with lots of other people. It's like a collaborative game, so it's really great if you have like 6 or 5 people to play the game. But recently, I've been going down various rabbit holes. The two games that I'm currently focused on is Divided Europe by David Thompson right now, which looks at sort of a influence mechanic game. Um, which I'm finding more and more interesting of how to represent non-kinetic elements, right? As a designer, I'm really sort of curious of how do we represent cyber? How do we represent sort of disinformation and influence, right? And so I'm trying to do more and more research in that regard, and that's really piqued my interest recently. There are a couple other games commercially that I find interesting topically wise, in terms of, I mean, I really find naval and maritime warfare really interesting. So that's sort of where I gravitate towards too. I gravitate towards the tactical and sort of operational level. But I love playing Game of Thrones Risk with my students. It is absolutely an easy game, super easy. If you ever played Risk, it's pretty much the same mechanic, but I sort of have a Game of Thrones like Chrome layer on top of it, right? So there's characters and stuff, and there are a few extra elements that make it a little bit better versus Risk. And I love playing that game because you ever want to see a bunch of A-type achiever grad students like be prepared to murder each other in less than 3 hours and 4 hours. This is the game for you, right? It's great. I get to teach them about game design. It's really dynamic and easy to learn. It's a nice little gateway sort of game for that. So I love playing that with my students. I'm looking forward to doing it again with my students in the spring. So that's a long-winded answer of saying lots of games. It really depends on my mood. As a designer, I usually try to pick or play games that are either going to inspire me, teach me something new, or I'm curious about how someone has done something, right? Whether it's how they did cyber attacks, or how they are representing influence and persuasion, or how did they do like drones in tactical modern warfare, right? So like I'm always trying to learn from other people.
Awesome. And Ian, I've heard, through the rumor mill known as LinkedIn, that you have your own game that's either coming out or has recently come out. Do you mind talking about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I can hit that real quick, and I'd start off that I can blame Sebastian almost entirely for the fact that it exists or that it will exist.
Mhm.
Because to kind of circle back to the institutional commitment, I didn't mention that Sebastian's game, Littoral Commander, also got a fairly large service commitment from on the Marine Corps University side because under Tim Barrick and the wargaming directorate there, they procured copies for all of the staff academies, the enlisted schools across the Marine Corps, which is a not insignificant number. So you've now got Marines, and I know Sebastian is he's a former enlisted Marine. It makes him really happy that you've now got where staff sergeants and gunnies and sergeants are getting trained and educated. The Total Commander is there on the table, putting a sandbox for future warfighting ideas out there in front of them. And if it's your NCOs and your staff NCOs who are at the pointy end of the spear, they're really making a lot of the decisions and dealing with the hard problems of up from close and personal combat. So that the fact that they now have this game system accessible to them is fantastic. But this also leads into why the card game. So because of work on Littoral Commander, I started tinkering with like scenario design and adaptation of game mechanics to new scenarios. And then I hit a point where I was like, why don't I let me try my own game here for a second. And I sort of reached back to my much younger days of playing Star Wars customizable card game, um, and kind of like taking the same approach that Sebastian took to Littoral Commander, which is how can we offer a war game tool that is accessible, relatively simple, and has a very low like overhead to be able to play it. So Littoral Commander, you can play all you need is a light source and a flat table, right? And maybe something to keep the dice from flying everywhere. But you can play it basically anywhere, right? So I kind of took that same approach. Um, and and I thought I was like, what if I could put a card like my favorite thing about the Star Wars card game and a lot of different like deck construction games is everything you need in the game is in like a stack of 60 or so cards. So I sort of took my childhood inspiration, a lot of the lessons I learned on scenario design, working on Littoral Commander and other things at the Krulak Center, and just kind of in my own time over the last 18 months, started trying to build a deck construction game about future warfare. And it's now available for pre-order, actually, through the same company that published Sebastian's Littoral Commander. So I think it's great now that this company has a couple of options out there for Marines to go and get their wargaming on. And I've also it's an experiment for me in using AI imagery as well to make game graphics. Something I've never used before, but it's obviously becoming more and more proliferated, and it definitely gives the game kind of like this eerie, like um, you know it looks kind of real, but there's like sort of an ethereal feel to it that I really really like, which is what I'm kind of trying to capture in the game. It's like, it's the game about the future, and the future is it's unreal. It's nebulous and changing, and it's kind of what I want the game to capture. So um, yeah, so the LinkedIn is true. Yeah, it exists in prototype, and it'll be in production hopefully next year.
All right, well, awesome. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you for coming on our show. To all of our Marines out there and other listeners, go ahead, get your reps and sets in, get wargaming, and take this knowledge that you learned from to make sure it stays institutional. Until next time.
A common axiom is that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Another axiom is that we sweat in peace so that we don't bleed in war. Here at the Marine Corps Association, we fully understand both. That is why we offer, through our professional development page on our website, a comprehensive catalog of battle studies, tactical and ethical decision games, and war games to ensure that not only do we learn from the past, but we embrace the thoughts and decisions that influence the outcomes of some of the greatest actions of the Marine Corps. We have tools and techniques that will enhance both unit training as well as enable comprehensive self-study. Check out all that the Marine Corps Association has to offer on our website. Go to mca-marines.org/professional-development. That's mca-marines.org/professional-development. And get your reps and sets in.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. I am William Truding, but you've also heard the voices or contributions of Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, or Ty Frazier. The opinions expressed in this episode do not reflect the official stance of the Marine Corps, DoD, or Marine Corps Association.